All right, why don't we get started? Probably people filtering in from the keynotes. My name is Brian Fox. I'm co-founder and CTO at Sonatype. I'm also on the OpenSSF governing board. And as of last week, actually, I was appointed to the Singapore Monetary Authority's Cyber Resiliency and Technology Experts panel. So that's kind of a new thing. So I don't know what that means yet, but it sounds cool. We've been working with FINOS for a while now, and with some of the member companies. Many of the member companies actually are customers of Sonatype. Yeah, we're good. But we've been working with FINOS because they've been trying to figure out how to better help the community and the member companies manage their supply chain and understanding what dependencies are important to the ecosystem and these kinds of things. And so this initiative here kind of came out of that effort. So I'm going to talk about two pieces of it. The first part is the thing that Gab was talking about on the keynote, the dependency composition analysis for member companies, and then also I'll talk briefly about some of the tooling that we put in place for the open source projects at FINOS. And so this is the page here. This went live as of this morning. So if you want to go and see more about what I'm talking about and sign up, you should be able to do so on that link at the bottom there. So the idea here is to be able to use some of the visibility that Sonatype has to be able to provide an analysis for the member companies to understand how well they are actually managing their supply chain. So does anybody here know about Maven Central? Is this a fairly familiar topic? Oh, there's Eddie. You were hiding back there. I thought you disappeared on me. Okay, so Maven Central is the repository of open source Java. Basically, there isn't another one anymore. And so everybody in the world that's doing Java is, of course, using some open source components. They're downloading those components from a repository that Sonatype runs on behalf of the community. And so that visibility that we get by running that repository has helped fuel a lot of conversations, a lot of reports that we put out, and of course this aspect here. So what's interesting is that, basically, in 2024, I think it's rare these days to have an organization that doesn't have some process in place to manage the dependencies and manage their supply chain. But I'll tell you what, from looking at the statistics, there's not a lot of good processes in place that are managing them. We see so many organizations that have something, and then we take a look at what we can see, and we can see that those controls are being massively bypassed and that their developers are doing things they shouldn't be. And so that's why we want to offer this service to let organizations kind of check. If everything is locked down as you expect, then we shouldn't be able to see anything. And I'll tell you what, I've never seen a report that wasn't some form of horrifying. And so this is all an effort to try to help the community do a better job. So basically what I have here, we have some sample slides from a mythical Acme. I don't even know if this was a real company that was pulled together and then anonymized. It probably was, but I don't actually know, so you can't pin me down and make me tell you, because I really don't know. But they are some interesting trends. So when we do the analysis, what we're looking for are your egress points from your development infrastructure, your developers, your CI servers, and what have you. We can pull those usually from publicly available sources, but if you are able to provide us your actual known egress points, we can even get more precise, right? So for most large financial organizations, we're going to be able to get a pretty decent look at your consumption just by, doing the IP lookups. Financial orgs are one of the last ones these days that still buy T1s and have registered namespaces and all these things. But again, if you are able to locate your actual egress points, we can add those and do a better job of pulling that. So when you sign up, what happens is we're going to go and do that. We're going to look back at the history. We're going to build a report like that, and we're going to sit down and have a conversation with slides that look very similar to this. Hopefully in your organization they're better, but I would bet that they're probably not. That's just how I am. I'm a little dark. I've seen a lot of stuff in the last 17 years from running this repository. So the first aspect, just to level set, with organizations, gives a little bit of context, because that first question we always get asked for people that aren't familiar is like, well, how did you get this data, right? So I gave you that explanation a little bit already, but just for context, we're looking at about 1.4 trillion downloads from Maven Central this year. And it continues to grow. So even though Java is, getting a little long in the tooth, the growth still continues at hockey stick upward trajectory. Some of these are older statistics here, but there's a lot of repository content. There's more than 84,000 high-level namespaces, so things like Apache, Eclipse, and FINOS, and then all the projects underneath there. As of earlier this year, 13.2 million different component releases in the repository, right? So there's a lot of stuff from developers to choose from. We are launching, just like FINOS announced their State of Open Source and Finance, did I get that right? Report today, the Sonatype's annual report, the State of the Software Supply Chain, is coming out next week on 10/10. And we did some analysis of the components that are out there in the world. The number of ones that are actually pretty frequently used is fairly low. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, and I'm probably not supposed to tell you if I did, but I think it's in like the low single digits in terms of percentage wise. So it's really interesting that you've got these billions of components that are out there, but a very small number are actually frequently used. Did you have a question?
I was wondering if your metadata includes in the POM files dependencies to things that are hosted by vendors in self-managed Maven, because there's going to be a mix. The majority is in Maven Central.
Yeah.
We still have a lot of dependencies that may come from a vendor that's self-hosting Maven.
Yeah, so the report, so there's two sort of phases to that report. The main part of it is literally just what you're downloading from us, and we can't tell, because we don't see your internal POM files. We just see the developers downloading things. If you happen to have a Nexus repository, we can sometimes look a little bit deeper, and then we can see the other things you're proxying, including other ecosystems and some of that, and give a next level set of analyses. But the high level from Maven Central doesn't have the visibility of that piece of it. So this you may have seen, we've been showing this for a while, but this was the download statistics of Log4j in the early days after the Log4Shell was unleashed on all of us back in, 21, before Christmas. And you could see early days there was an initial uptick of people that are adopting the fixed version. So the red here indicates the percentage of the consumption pattern that was still of Log4Shell. So of course, before it was announced, everybody had vulnerable versions, and then you could see slowly that these things were being picked up. And so we made these publicly available, and we were using these for a long time to push the message, because it took us basically 3 years to get to about 30%. To get down to 30%, but 1/3 of the versions of Log4j still being downloaded nearly 3 years later is just not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. Actually, we've seen recently, we've seen it come down quite a bit, and that'll be covered in the report, but 3 years is way too long. And so this kind of is the sort of information that we can sit on and we can look at and get an understanding of what's going on in the world. This part here, again, this report would be for your stakeholders to kind of give them a context of what else is out there in the other ecosystems. And so the thing to keep in mind as we look at this, while the analysis from our perspective is limited to that Maven Central Java side, it's fair to say that if you don't have controls over Java, you definitely don't have controls over JavaScript and all these other things. In fact, just naturally, organizations may have Java more locked down than JavaScript and Python and all these other things for lots of reasons, right? Python often is used by business analysts and not development, so it may not even go through the normal DevOps type of pipeline, and so your controls there are usually worse. So if we take a look at this, some of the things that we can provide interesting input into or visibility into is where actually are your downloads going. This one here is giving you a view into, how frequently they are and month over month. So were there changes? Did you change your topology? You know, sometimes these provide interesting things. We've had some organizations that tell us, well, all those vulnerable downloads that are happening, it must be those remote engineers like over in, you know, pick a country that they're contracting to. And then we go back and we look and we're like, yeah, but all the downloads are happening during US business hours, you know, so there tends to be this rationalization that goes on, and so we can dive deeper and try to provide that visibility. And so, you know, one of the views is like, where are they coming from? Sorry, I didn't realize that was a build. You know, but like in this particular one, they were all coming from the desert. What did that mean to that company? I don't know, because I don't know who this is. Maybe it was a government contractor and they had, you know, secret stuff in the desert. I don't know. But that type of information is the kind of stuff that we can pull for an organization to understand where all that stuff is coming from. How much of it's coming from the cloud? How much of it is coming from Europe or whatever? Then we take a look at, of the downloads that are happening, you know, how many of them are actually vulnerable? Let me build this out. I didn't realize those were builds. How many of them are vulnerable, and how bad is it? And is that trending in a positive direction, right? And we usually will pull relevant stats from the industry so that we can compare how well you're doing to compared to others. Now, one of the stats that we've published multiple years in a row is that when something is being downloaded from Maven Central that is known to be vulnerable at that time, 95% of the time, there is already a fix available. You know, so in the wake of Log4j, we saw a lot of conversation from regulators and people that weren't really clued in, saying, oh, those open source people, they need to do a better job. But we're sitting there looking at the stats going, no, they fixed it, and the consumers keep downloading the thing over and over and over again that's known to be vulnerable. Right? So this helps provide some useful visibility into that breakdown and where they're going. This particular instance, these look like Nexus repository versions, so they must have had a bunch of them running. And so that can provide a little bit of insight too. You know, and if you're running Artifactory, we can tell you about that as well, because we can tell the difference from the downloads on Maven Central, which one's which. All right. And this is the month-over-month one. I was alluding to that before. So how have the behaviors changed? You know, if you rolled out a new program, you would want to see that show up here. Sometimes it doesn't. You know, and the other thing that we can see, I think, well, I'm not going to jump ahead. I'll get to that in a second. This is a different look at the Log4j trend. And so this one here, what we show is when organizations are actually managing this properly, you could see that there is, in green, a marked difference in the behavior and the speed at which organizations were able to fix Log4j. Unsurprisingly, if you were able to alert all of your development teams the day it hit the streets that they needed to make a version update, is going to be much faster than organizations who spent 6 months emailing everybody asking if you were using Log4j. And what we saw was that there were a number of prospects that came to us using different tools that weren't ours. And it was conveniently interesting that the behavior was indistinguishable from everybody in the rest of the world, that Log4j that basically flatlined. Right? And so this is a really interesting thing to be able to compare yourself. So if you have a process in place, how did Log4j look like? And we should be able to look back far enough to be able to kind of give that visibility into your organization, because we have the logs all the way back. So it's a really interesting bellwether. Yeah?
So you're talking a lot about after the fact, right? What about being proactive and catching something before?
Yeah. There is. This report is trying to highlight if what you have in place is able to do it or not. We provide those tools, of course, right? So there is the proactivity. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's really important when you get to the malicious components of it. But the point of this is I talk to a lot of organizations who tell me, I got that control covered. It's good. I'm fine. I don't need to be proactive. Or we think we're being proactive, and then I have to rain on their parade and go, yeah, but you look like this, not like that. So whatever you're doing, it's not working. Let's talk about how we can help make it better. Question?
I know you have your own security team for vulnerability assessments,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to the CVE metadata. Do you have an analysis that looks at the entirety of Maven Central and classify these by shelf life to say, yeah, on average, this is gonna go vulnerable with some vulnerability in 7 days versus 20 days versus 1 day. Whether there's a class, because you have enough data, historical data, to say, yeah, this thing has a shelf life of 3 days, just because of the nature of that life.
Conveniently, we did do some of that analysis in this year's SSCR report, and we tried to break down projects based on like the corrosive nature of it. You know, there are certain projects where vulnerabilities tend to be caught fairly quickly and they exist only in fairly recent code versus other projects where a vulnerability is found, like the log4j one, that affects a lot of stuff, and we found some interesting behavioral patterns out of that, right? And in previous years, we've launched the Sonatype safety rating, which takes into account things like the open SSF scorecard score, as well as how quickly those projects remediate, and we can provide a score visibility on that as well to help make better decisions about the open source projects. I think that's where you're going.
IQ policy engine?
Yes, yeah, the health,
You can make decisions based on that.
the health and all of that stuff, that's right, yep, yep.
Do you separate reports for the SOX complaints if any applications want the SOX complaints as a separate report?
From this particular view, we can't tell. We could do that from the IQ or from the actual product because we know which application is being scanned in that context. From Maven Central, we have no idea. All we're seeing is what the downloads are coming from. So we can't separate it out by application by application.
Is there any way, like if I don't know what is my egress endpoints, is there any way through the network traffic able to figure it out, or what are the things coming from the Nexus versus the
Yeah, we have some techniques to try to figure that out. It may not be perfect, but what I've found is that if we can find even some of it, it usually is not that different in one region or another. Sometimes it can be, but you know, if your controls are lacking and it shows up in one spot, it usually is telling for the rest of it. So it doesn't have to be perfect egress, but there are ways that we can work together to figure it out. So that'll be part of that conversation after you sign up. We'll take a look and see, well, this is what we find out of the box. Does this feel right or not? Do we need to go deeper, and how might we get that information? So it's a little bit of an iterative process up front. Okay, so the other part that tends to be interesting for organizations is sort of the word cloud, not just which ones are vulnerable, but which components you happen to be using, and then conclusions from that as well. There was one organization that we analyzed, this was a while ago now, but it was still interesting. At the time, there were 84 different versions of Spring, and that organization had been using, within the last 30 days, like 81 of those versions. So they basically had almost a perfect score of all the versions of Spring somewhere in their portfolio, which is nuts, yes, if you think about it, because not only were they subjected to some of the vulnerabilities in Spring, they were actually subjected to every single one of them because they were using all of the code somewhere in the organization, right? And so that visibility can be sometimes shocking to people as well. So part of this analysis helps you understand what we can see is going on and what you're actually using and how that fits together. This part here, would break down based on what tools are actually being used. So these would be coming from the user agent. So we can tell you the percentage of Maven versus Gradle versus Artifactory versus Nexus versus, you know, Eclipse and other random scripting tools that are out there. Sometimes that can be interesting, especially if an organization has a program in place and a certain subset of the tooling is bypassing, let's say, the Nexus repository or whatnot. You can help track that down based on that. So this helps give some visibility, and we can also compare it. You know, is a disproportionate share of the risk coming from one tool versus another is another piece of this that can be really interesting. Okay, this is the by IP thing that I was giving you an example of before. This would depend on the organization. And so usually after we look at the report, we can kind of pull together what's relevant, interesting observations from that particular organization, these would be different, right? So it's not formulaic. We are actually looking at the data, trying to make heads or tails of it, and then making recommendations based on it. This particular organization was downloading a lot of the vulnerable Spring versions at that time, so we wanted to highlight that for them. I think this, the 99.7 calls back to those repository managers that they had a lot of different repos in place, and a bunch of them were coming from very old versions of that infrastructure. So sometimes we can tell that too, like if you've got outdated Jenkins or outdated Maven builds and things like that, you know, it may not, the problem may not necessarily be what you're downloading, but it's what you're downloading with, that there may be vulnerabilities in that part of the infrastructure. Let's see, I'm almost out of time here. I want to jump ahead a little bit. Let's see. So if we talk about the malicious part of it, so for reasons that I could do a whole talk on, there are basically not any known vulnerable intentionally malicious components in Maven Central. This has been a new pattern that's been, this rise of intentionally malicious components has been something we've been tracking and talking about since 2017. I'll give you a little bit of a preview. In this year's report, we talk about the fact that the number of known malicious components has doubled again this year. But we're talking big numbers now. It doubled because we added 350,000 this year alone, which is shocking. So these are intentional malicious components put out there into one of the repositories, usually NPM, Python, and Ruby. Those are the targets. So the Maven Central analysis won't give visibility into that. There are reasons because of the way we manage the repository and just the way Maven fundamentally makes it work that there aren't people targeting Maven Central right now with intentionally malicious components. But this is a piece of the puzzle that needs to be paid attention to in an organization. And so if you have a repository manager in your organization, we can usually look and see what's inside there from the other ecosystems, and that's what I was talking about, the multi-layered approach to go beyond Maven Central and give you that visibility into it. But what's important is that you need to be able to do, to your question earlier, ma'am, the proactive attack. And so the point of this is many of these malicious components, they deliver their payload and they execute when the developer's machine downloads it. So they're stealing data, they're stealing AWS keys, they're, you know, whatever, SSH keys, they're dropping backdoors. We see all of the things. And they won't show up in scans in your CI and other things later because they triggered on the development system. And so the way to defend against that is by having the developers go through your repository manager with something like a repository firewall that is actually assessing those components and making a real-time determination of it. And that's something we've been doing a ton of. And so one of the things from the Maven Central report is we can tell you how many of these, what we call shadow downloads, are happening. So if you've got a lot of development that's not going through your repository manager, you don't have visibility, you don't have control, and you definitely don't have protection over these types of things, right? So that's part of the conversation that we have with that analysis. You know, and so this is sort of what a protection defense might look like, where you have developers proxying through the repository firewall, and then the system is able to, based on real-time metadata, decide if it's okay, if it's quarantined, or if it's known to be bad, and block it automatically, right? So that's a really important aspect of this. So almost at time here. I'm going to jump way ahead to the other aspect of what we've been doing. So if we look at the overall pipeline, a lot of what I've been talking about is far on the left with the downloads and the firewall and that other part. For the FINOS projects, we've been basically providing hosted access to what is effectively Sonatype lifecycle. And so we have some projects that have already onboarded. Morphere, I don't know, Eddie, if there were any more yet.
The ones that are in the pipeline right now are common lab controls and the architecture is coding.
Okay, so they're on and they're using, oh, that looks really really blurry, doesn't it, at scale? But that gives a breakdown of the actual dependencies inside of those applications based on the policy that's configured. And so the policy is looking at security posture, the legal, whether the open source license is compliant, what the quality of the dependencies are, and providing them information to hopefully make better choices about those dependencies. So this is a high-level shot of the dashboard of multiple projects. This is a more detailed report, and again, sorry, it's blurry when it's scaled up there. That gives them more information, and if they were to drill in, it would give them guidance and recommendations about what versions are actually, compliant with the policy to make better decisions, right? So the two phases that we've chosen to take the approach is to help the members understand what their dependency usage is, whether their supply chain controls are working or not, and figure out how to make that better. And then on the other side, we're helping to scan the applications that are being developed in the foundation to help them do a better job. And then there are some conversations that have been happening to do a second level of analysis. So when we've done, enough of the member downloads from Maven Central, what we're also doing is we're building up the data set of what dependencies are these organizations using that are member companies, and then we can use that to help target the next level of conversation if we want to invest FINOS funds, for example, to sponsor development on those projects or to help improve them, right? So that's why this part is sort of, it's a two-step kind of process. Help you guys understand what's going on, help the organization understand what everybody's using, and then figure out what to do with it from there. So I have basically 1 minute for any follow-up questions, or you can talk to me out there.
Say it for the record.
Say it for the record. The board has been very involved in this conversation. I've been attending multiple board meetings as we talk through this process, right? So I think Gab kicked this off initially. That's why I said in the beginning it's been a long conversation to figure out where we can go, what we want to do. There's been a lot of ideas on the table, but this was one that just seemed like a no-brainer and didn't really cost anything. This is data that Sonatype has, and we're willing to do the analysis and provide it as a benefit because it was also helped drive some of the follow-on things. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.